Another day, another story. A White House report confirms that the U.S. is open to researching solar radiation modification, or sunblocking. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, but some researchers want to cool the Earth by reflecting sunlight back into space.
Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel.
The outlandish idea is currently trending, after the U.S. voiced interest in studying solar radiation modification, SRM, as a possibility, according to a White House report last week. Advocates claim it could reduce the devastating impacts of climate change, and even refreeze the poles. SRM offers the possibility of cooling the planet significantly on a timescale of a few years, the report states. Earlier in the year, several news outlets also reported that the United Nations are keen to explore it. How could blocking the sun stop climate change? Sun blocking technologies, also known as solar radiation modification, could theoretically cool down the Earth by reflecting sunlight back into space. One idea involves pumping sun-blocking particles into the upper atmosphere. This process of stratospheric aerosol injection would involve planes spraying an aerosol like sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This mist of particles would reflect the sun back upwards, shading the Earth. The method has already worked, albeit accidentally. When Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted in 1991, it released thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide. The global temperature temporarily dropped by 0.5 degrees Celsius. In September 2022, researchers at Yale University argued that the injection method could hypothetically refreeze the poles. Are the US and UN keen to explore this technology? A White House report published last Friday confirms that the US is open to researching SRM. A program of research into the scientific and societal implications of solar radiation modification, SRM, would enable better informed decisions about the potential risks and benefits of SRM as a component of climate policy, alongside the foundational elements of greenhouse gas emissions mitigation and adaptation, it says. However, the report also clarifies that no decision has been made to establish a comprehensive research program focused on solar radiation modification. In February, several news outlets are reporting that the UN wants to explore this technique. This could give the impression that the organization has approved sunblocking as a viable tool to fight climate change. Unfortunately for tech enthusiasts, this is not the case. White House floats the idea of blocking out the sun. For years, advocates have refused to consider the possibility that geoengineering to slow climate change could be an option on the table. But we may be at a point where its use is inevitable. Last week, the U.S. government tiptoed a little closer to the world of science fiction. In a 44-page report it seemed at pains to say was not its own idea. The White House laid out a 5-year research plan to explore the development and eventual deployment of solar radiation management, or SRM, technology, the idea of blocking out the sun to slow down climate change. Skeptics say SRM is dangerous and untested, and has a laundry list of potential impacts that, similarly, seem straight out of a disaster movie. Worsened winters, disappearing monsoons, damage to the ozone layer, and droughts that could devastate already dry regions. In recent years, prominent climate scientists have organized to call for a total moratorium on researching and testing the technology. But others say its deployment is becoming virtually inevitable as the world's biggest polluters, the United States among them, appear incapable of making the large-scale adjustments necessary to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. The UN Environmental Programme's recent report into SRM concludes that it is not currently a realistic or wise plan. UNEP concurs with the panel that, at present, large-scale or operational deployment of SRM technologies is not necessary, viable, prudent or sufficiently safe, given the limited scientific understanding and uncertainty about the potential impacts and unintended consequences, says UNEP's chief scientist Andrea Hinwood. The review concludes that SRM cannot replace reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Nonetheless, the body doesn't rule out the method altogether, with the report concluding that their assessment of the technique may change should climate action remain insufficient. What does the research on sunblocking show? Research into the sun-blocking technique has yielded mixed results. Even its passionate advocates usually call for a reduction in global emissions first. The Yale report outlined a hypothetical plan to turn the global thermostat, according to lead author Wake Smith. If their plan was implemented, 125 high-flying jets would periodically spray the particles into the atmosphere at latitudes of 60 degrees north and south, roughly around northern Alaska and the southern tip of Patagonia. The particles would slowly drift towards the poles, cooling the Earth below by 2 degrees Celsius. The authors suggest that there is potential global benefit in their plan, which would cost around $11 billion, 11.3 billion euros. There is widespread and sensible trepidation about deploying aerosols to cool the planet, Smith says. But if the risk-benefit equation were to pay off anywhere, it would be at the poles. But the plan poses other potential problems. It would require 175,000 particle spraying flights per year, which would release millions of tons of greenhouse gases into the air. To address climate change, the world must rapidly reduce its reliance on fossil fuels, Smith warns. Game-changing though this could be in a rapidly warming world, stratospheric aerosol injections merely treat a symptom of climate change but not the underlying disease, he says. It's aspirin, not penicillin. It's not a substitute for decarbonization. The question becomes, what should we do, given that we're not doing what we should be doing? Said Toby Svoboda, an environmental ethicist at Colgate University and the author of a book on the ethics of climate engineering. Politically, this is pretty significant, that the Biden administration would signal their openness to this. For the uninitiated, SRM encompasses an array of highly controversial geoengineering techniques that minimize the warming impact of the sun, and thus the worsening impacts of human-caused climate change, primarily by injecting reflective chemical compounds into the Earth's atmosphere. Ordered by Congress as part of a 2022 appropriations bill, the new White House report stops short of issuing a new policy directive on the technology or its use. But it does suggest developing scenarios in which SRM might be used, and even supports testing the technology in small-scale, real-world deployments. In calling for more study, the report acknowledges that the potentially irreversible impacts of SRM on human health and the environment are still largely unknown. But it proposes what it calls a risk versus risk approach, which would weigh any possible impacts that could be discerned from SRM against potentially worse outcomes if the world, as expected, fails to meet climate targets. While recognizing its drawbacks may be significant, the report largely frames its key research questions about SRM in a positive, market-friendly light, asking how the technology might ensure the survival of natural capital dividends, bolster the weakest links in global and national supply chains, and reduce the risk of housing, insurance, and other market failures. And while the report acknowledges that deploying SRM technology would come with significant geopolitical risks, it also says the U.S. should prepare for possible deployment of SRM by other public or private actors, and develop the tools needed to detect it. The report has not come too soon. Some limited SRM technology has already been deployed in China to mitigate the impact of droughts. Billionaire investors like Bill Gates, George Soros, and Jeff Bezos have poured millions into SRM research. And venture capital-backed private enterprises are beginning to actively test the limits of current regulations. These recent developments have increased calls for a global agreement governing research and use of SRM technology. But while the White House report says some level of global cooperation is in America's best interest, its recommendations fall far short of an international agreement on ground rules for research and deployment. Shuchi Talati, a former Biden appointee to the Department of Energy and founder of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, said the report may nonetheless act as an incentive for these groups to realize that they deserve a seat at this table. The fact that this report exists encourages more countries to think about their role in this space, she said. But other experts said the report shows a global framework for SRM technology is increasingly unlikely. The failure of recent climate agreements to bind key contributors to emissions, like the U.S., has many preparing for the likelihood that the technology is developed and even deployed by a country or company acting unilaterally. Make Sunsets, the VC-backed firm that sold individual credits for sulfur dioxide released into the air via balloons, made itself an example recently of how easily an independent actor can take advantage of the current lack of regulations. The venture was widely criticized by industry insiders for its technique, as well as the lack of concrete data on the actual cooling effects of its work. and was shut down by the Mexican government shortly after it began releasing balloons in Baja California earlier this year. But it's not difficult to imagine a slightly more sophisticated firm finessing regulators ahead of time to launch similar projects that won't get shut down, and could have a wide array of possible and unpredictable side effects. Given that they are developing it, eventually, somebody will try it, said Rita Floyd, an associate professor in conflict and security at the University of Birmingham. It's inevitable it will happen, at least on a small scale. Any unilateral deployment would likely pose some serious ethical dilemmas. The most promising method of SRM, known as stratospheric aerosol injection, works by mimicking the effects of a volcanic eruption, like the 1815 event that produced Europe's infamous Year Without Summer. As such, its effects are exceedingly difficult to predict and nearly impossible to contain. The benefits are also likely to be temporary. Stopping aerosol injections, experts say, would produce a termination shock, a rapid and highly damaging increase of temperatures. Any deployment would soon create a global dependency on the unending, costly use of the technology. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.